Thanks to everyone for joining us on this chilly morning. There's perhaps no more opportune time to be discussing grid reliability than in the middle of a deep freeze, as this is usually the exact type of event that gets a lot of us in the electricity policy world a bit nervous. But with that said, we're going to have no shortage of things to discuss about recent events, past events, and looking forward to grid reliability in the long term. We've got an all-star panel here today. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers here in a minute, but just a couple quick run of show items. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please do feel free to throw your questions in the chat. We'll try to reserve the last 10 to 15 minutes for that. And feel free to throw in questions before that time period, just as I will be checking that box as we encourage the more organic side of the discussion here. So with that, let's get going. We have some fantastic speakers in no particular order. I'd like to start with Gordon Van Welle. Gordon was the longtime president CEO of ISO New England. He just retired at the end of the last calendar year, so he's not speaking on behalf of ISO New England, but in many ways, he has all the knowledge that he would otherwise have, except now he doesn't have a filter. So, Gordon, we're renaming this event Gordon Unleashed in your honor. And then we're going to also have to dig into some of the technical side on the numbers. We have John Mora. John is the Director of Reliability Assessment and Systems Analysis for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC. NERC is for those who are unfamiliar. NERC is the body that sort of quarterbacks grid reliability standards, and then they also serve a function of providing information to industry and stakeholders through the reliability assessments. So John will be able to touch on both those functions from a NERC purview here today. And then getting into more like the industry stakeholder camp, we're joined by Todd Schnitzler. He's the president and CEO of the Electric Power Supply Association. So he represents independent or competitive power producers. And finally, we have Beth Garza, our senior fellow. She's been on our team for, what's it been, Beth? About half a
5 years, yeah,
five,
5+ years.
5 years now, half a decade, and she joined us after she left the post of being the director of the market monitoring services at ERCOT, or the Texas grid. So we'll have a nice little back and forth today about how the Texas and the South and the Northeast have had some similar but different challenges during these cold weather snaps. But before we dig into talking shop, let's start off with a little bit more of a high-level view on the state of reliability today, and sort of what's driving a lot of that long-term outlook and what those key parameters are. I'm going to kick it over to John to kind of give us that high-level view, and then we'll go to our other panelists.
All right. Thanks, Devin. Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Like Devin said, my name is John Mora, Director of Reliability Assessments at NERC. And really, today's message is pretty straightforward. Reliability risk is increasing, and really not because we lack awareness, but because the system is changing quite significantly and quite and faster than the infrastructure needed to support it. And really, today is a great day. Today, we're releasing our annual long-term reliability assessment. And I'll start by an important clarification. Our report, our annual report, it's not a prediction of the outages. It's not a forecast of impending blackouts. It's a risk assessment. It's based on a snapshot in time, roughly mid 2025. And it uses the best information available at that time about demand growth, resource plans, and transmission development. But what the LTRA does evaluate is where the system could face stress if conditions unfold as they're currently planned. It does show risk trajectory, which I think is probably the most important outcome out of the long-term assessment. Is not just a snapshot in time, but year on year, we've seen this progression in the trajectory of risk, and just as important, it shows that there's still time to act. And the results shouldn't be taken as an indictment of those areas, or in fact, there's certain elevated risk areas and certain high risk areas. The level of engagement at the industry level has and the analytical rigor behind the assessments had never been greater. But again, it's not about the lack of effort. It's really the pace and the scale of the system transformation occurring at the same time as demand growth. And so, speaking of demand growth, electricity is being used in different ways than really ever have before, and we're all reliant more on electricity than ever. The patterns are changing. Even here in Georgia, I'm a winter peaking customer. Because of the change behavior even I've had on my system. So the whole system's changing, the customers are changing, and that rising dependence on electricity that really underpins health, security, prosperity across North America, that rising dependence is why I think the assessments matter so much. So just give a little insight on kind of what the assessment holds for us in this period of uncertainty. Rapid and sometimes volatile demand growth. We see large new data centers. We're in our assessment. We're not counting every single prospecting data center that's coming in. We've taken quite a bit of a haircut to look at reasonably expected actual load integrations. Generation retirements. There's continued transmission and permitting delays. Supply chain constraints really makes the resource mix and what we're expecting in the future to come in, especially on some of these aggressive timelines, makes that a risk. And then the resource mix is changing, increasingly dependent on weather, fuel availability, and timing. Even technologies that we're building that we consider firm, natural gas, even those are energy constrained under certain conditions. And we've seen that especially during these extreme weather conditions. Solar and wind, they all have duration and output limitations. And those aren't flaws. Those are characteristics of different types of resources that must be planned and managed. And at this point, really, all resources are important to get on the grid as fast as possible to support reliability. So I'll just kind of conclude and looking forward to more discussion. The message on our long-term assessment, it's not to alarm, it's to align and really put out that urgency call. Removing siting and permitting barriers, accelerating resource and transmission development. The ERAS projects in the ISO RTOs are really good at bringing those resources online faster. We need to preserve essential reliability services. We've seen some of this break down in other countries, the Iberian Peninsula, where we have very high renewable output, right? Where they didn't really kind of coordinate those inverter controls correctly. So concerned about maintaining those essential reliability services to support grid stability. And then finally, improving fuel and energy assurance into market frameworks, into a regulatory construct where we can actually send the right price signals so we can actually build the infrastructure needed. So that's kind of the very high level. Looking forward to more questions. But yeah, reliability is built years in advance. So right now we're kind of catching up to a period where we didn't really build a lot of resources over the last decade. So thanks, Devin.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Let's go over to Todd next to give a little bit of an industry perspective on what do folks with skin in the game see in the field right now, and what conditions are emerging on the reliability frontier.
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. And John did a nice job of kind of laying out the technical framework. I'll tell you from our members' perspective, the challenges that we're seeing are I'm a movie guy, and so I feel like we're living in the middle of everything, everywhere, all at once, where we've got all the issues that we have not had a lot of experience over the last 20 years dealing with. Rapid load growth was not a phenomenon that we were dealing with. We had flat to declining growth, frankly, in large parts of the country for more than 20 years. We had a low price environment where there were very low costs for resources, and that's why you were seeing resources leave the system. We were adding resources in small bites and adding new load in very small bites. Well, that's been turned on its head over the last really 12 to 18 months, where the data center phenomenon, which had been really under the radar for a while, became front and center. You can't have a conversation or look at the paper and not see some story or six about data centers and load growth. And so that phenomenon has resulted in a reversal in many of those things. We need to retain the resources that are already on the system. John mentioned, resource retirements. I think we're seeing a lot of retirement announcements be withdrawn, and those units are going to run longer. We're seeing a real need for new resources to be added to the system over time. I do want to caution the panic button that some seem to be pushing, and that is not a criticism of NERC. I don't want it to come across that way. But some in the press are making statements about we've got to build, tens of thousands of megawatts. We've got 130 gigawatt load growth by 2030, which everybody's got a favorite forecast, right? I don't know which one is right, but I know some of them are wildly enthusiastic. And I know the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. So we can utilize our system now in the short term. We can really focus on the things that can be achieved in the short term to help bridge the gap and get to that long-term stasis that'll give the reliability that John and his shop are so interested in, as are we, frankly, in making sure that we can show up and deliver the electrons that are needed. But John noted a couple of things. I don't want to be repetitive, but I think he's 100% right. Supply chain risk is an issue. Permitting and siting issues are critically important in order to accelerate deployment of resources. If you look at where we stand in a number of parts of the country, some of which are vertically integrated and some of which are restructured, you see tens and tens of gigawatts of projects that are through the approval process and no longer caught up in the queue that's been a source of consternation, and they're not being constructed. And that's either because of financial decisions have to be made, site control issues, permitting and siting at the state or local level, or supply chain or workforce issues. So it's a laundry list of projects and things that are already through the queue that are the ones, if we're talking about speed to power, which is the nomenclature that we hear a lot these days, those are the projects that should be coming on or should be focused on immediately while we deal with the longer term investments that will be required for the projects that are being added to the queue or being considered for additions now. If you look at what's being done in PJM, which everybody seems to like to talk about, so I don't want to go too long without bringing it up. PJM's had about 12 and a half gigawatts of projects that have been announced since 2024 when we saw the first rise in prices. So our members and others have made announcements about investment decisions. You've seen the restart of the Crane Clean Energy Center, formerly 3 Mile Island. Just a couple of weeks ago, you saw the announcement by Vistra about the uprates to the nuclear fleet in Ohio and Pennsylvania. That's going to be 433 gigawatts of new nuclear capacity within 2 or 3 years. That's going to come on the system, as well as a number of other projects that are being developed by our members and others that I think are responding to the increase in demand and the price signals that say that retirement phase is probably behind us, and we're going to need to add new resources over time. And if the load forecasts are even remotely correct, we're going to see a build cycle that's going to last for quite some time as we sort through, how we get from here to a reliable, cost-effective system that really meets the nation's objectives about winning the AI race and making sure that we have got geopolitical success. There's adversaries around the world that would love to be first, and the administration has made very clear that we're going to be first, and so that's going to require power to get there. But I think from our perspective, the last point I would make is the key issue we're wrestling with is an appropriate load forecast. We have seen, and John noted the need for haircuts on load forecast because if we're aiming at something, I had a conversation with David Hill a couple months ago, and David said, we know we're going to be wrong, but we want to be wrong by as little as possible, and we want to be wrong to the positive, because that's how you minimize cost to consumers. That's how you ensure a reliable system. And that's how we ultimately deliver the outcomes that are favorable for everyone. And that's true for the wires utilities. That's true for generators. That's true for the data centers and AI companies. And most importantly, it's true for the consumers who ultimately utilize those services, but also have to pay the bills. And so those are a lot of the things that we're trying to contemplate all at once as we try to figure out how we're going to get through this period of misalignment between resource supply and demand, which is clearly being exposed. And then how do we have the longer term solutions that will resolve the issue going forward?
Absolutely. Thank you, Todd. And on that point of load growth and keeping reliability under those conditions, perhaps no jurisdiction has been more fascinating than Texas, other than PJM. And we'll come back to PJM here. Don't worry. Um, Everyone has to. But I want to turn it over to Beth. Beth, both for your views on sort of the state of Texas reliability and drivers, but also how you're involved in a lot of industry efforts more broadly. How do you also see like the national picture taking shape?
Well, I think, both, I think Todd and John both hit on some of the reliability challenges. And that's, from my perspective, as somebody who's been in the industry, and frankly, I used to do these kinds of analysis at the early part of my career. It's gotten more complicated to assess reliability. The process of figuring it out is more complicated now than ever. More moving pieces, more things to assess. The other aspect that, as an industry, as I look back, it's a little bit more general than you may have wanted, Devin. But as I look back, I think as an industry, we have been slow to respond to what our customers' expectations for reliability are. And I still hear it in terms, like, here's the reliability we're going to provide. And so that's an area for further exploration, is that what do customers expect for reliability, and the old lingo of 1 day in 10 years versus other parts of our industry that are, thinking more like the 6 9s of reliability, right? Those are two very, very different kinds of metrics, and somehow we've got to kind of bring those together. So that's kind of the I offer that up first just as an overview of kind of where I sit in this space from those complicated aspects. Speaking specifically, large loads and the Todd was nice when he talked about it. Some are more enthusiastic than others. Some of the forecast for load growth is more enthusiastic than others. I'm always unleashed. I'll say some of them are just crazy. Some of the forecasts we've seen for load growth are just untenable, both from a demand. There's not enough chips available to support the demand that's implied in that, and nor is there enough supply available to meet that from the supply perspective. So one layer is trying to, and we're continuing, I know here in Texas and ERCOT specifically, working through some of those. How do we assess that load forecast? How do we get down to what's a real number for planning? Plans are always wrong. You would like them to be useful. And if you've got a crazy amount, my words, if you've got a crazy amount of load being projected, it stifles anybody from, well, we know it's not that. It can't be that. Where's a reasonable amount to react to? I think I'm confident will work itself out through some of the efforts that are underway to add either more, sort of upfront financial commitments associated with these large loads, so you have a higher assurance of what is coming for them. From a more global sense, from a system, and part of reliability is reliability through markets, right? Defining markets that support these reliability goals that we're trying to achieve. And so one of the key aspects of that is the flexibility, and flexibility of big demand starts to be easier to talk about and is discussed quite frequently in a wide variety of ways, and can take multiple different, there are multiple ways to achieve that. But I'm hopeful that as we start focusing on these, sort of hundreds of megawatts, gigawatt scale kind of customer sizes and their potential flexibility, we then are able to expand those concepts more broadly to all customers in an aggregated basis. And we'd certainly get into some of that. Again, reliability is achieving, from my perspective, is achieving customers' expectations for reliability in the most cost-effective manner. And so bringing those back together, I think, is the goal.
Thanks, Beth. And it's definitely worth noting that a lot of those customer expectations, the loads that are growing tend to be big and very sophisticated, and they're getting pretty creative with their opportunities. And let's
Yeah, I'm going to call some of them out. As big as you'd think, and as sophisticated as they like to be, like to think themselves, I still see some pretty simplistic actions and reactions. But that's just me. I hold out hope for continued growth and development.
Absolutely. Let's turn it over to Gordon here, who's oftentimes held the his past job was oftentimes like perhaps the most terrifying from a reliability manager's perspective, especially this time of year. Gordon, would love to know more about how you view conditions in the region that you know so well, but also your views on the status of the reliability outlook for the country and any insights that you have therein.
Sure. Thanks very much, Devin. So, looking at the picture across the country, it seems to me that reliability is becoming more tenuous. The outlook is progressing unevenly because there are different factors at play in each of the regions. And obviously, the areas that are experiencing the biggest demand growth are the ones that are at greatest risk right now. What's interesting to me is that after almost 3 decades after the start of wholesale markets and many, many design iterations, the industry is still struggling to find a stable way to ensure resource adequacy. And this is, I think, particularly the case in the multi-state regions. And I think there are 3 primary factors that are creating the challenges. The first is this bifurcated nature of the responsibility for resource adequacy, particularly in multi-state regions, which is exacerbated by the misalignment between federal and state energy policies, which then typically lead to policy interventions from one election cycle to the next. So I think in the single state regions, there's more ownership of resource adequacy by the state, but in the multi-state situation, there's a lot more, this is your responsibility, and people sort of pointing at each other. And, I think, if I think about that situation, the structural issue there is that, and I make this comment particularly relevant to the Northeast regions, the markets become too dependent on the prompt auction structures without the backstop of robust bilateral financial hedging for load. And so this leaves retail consumers exposed to sharp shifts in demand patterns in the wholesale market, which then becomes a political problem and then attracts policy interventions. And we see that playing out in PJM today. So, I think we need to make clear the RTOs cannot be responsible for hedging retail load. This has to be done by the states and the local load serving entities. And this is what caused me to advocate for a joint and complementary role for resource adequacy between the states and the ISOs or FERC. So the ISOs can run the prompt, the spot market, and those price the prevailing supply and demand conditions. But ultimately, if you want to deal with managing the politics, you have to hedge retail consumers. And I think that is, those structures are inadequate today. And so the states have a role here, and hence my framing of this joint and complementary role. I think it's working better in the single state regions like Texas and California and New York because there's more local ownership there. I think SPP is working relatively well, but you can see the cracks in all the other multi-state regions. The second related factor here, I think that's driving reliability risk has already been mentioned, which is the difficulty of siting and permitting new infrastructure. The third factor has also been mentioned, which is it's pretty clear that power system infrastructure supply chains can't keep up with demand. But I'd like to expand this to say that we also have insufficient domestic manufacturing capability for critical grid components. So, what we've seen over the decades is a boom and bust cycle in this industry, similar to what's happened in the semiconductor industry. And given current day geopolitics, I really wonder whether the US can continue to be completely reliant on offshoring key grid components. So I think there's a policy question right there. So then I think there's another set of secondary factors that are also growing in importance, and they are cumulatively driving risk. So I'd say the biggest secondary factor is this mismatch between planning and paying for the gas system and the electric system, and the mismatch between the reliability standards for these two systems and the lack of recognition that the gas and electric systems have become one interdependent energy system. And we're still regulating these systems as if they're existing in independent silos. John, you and Mark and others have been doing great work at NERC, trying to move the standards, the body of standards that sort of regulate the reliability criteria for the industry. But you have massive inertia in the system, and so the energy and the resource adequacy standards in NERC are outdated. They don't recognize the interdependence of the gas and electric system, and many of the standards, do not take into account what's coming at us in the future. One example I would use here would be system inertia. I think this issue has got the potential to become a tragedy of the commons problem for both the Western and the Eastern interconnections. And we're better off trying to solve this in advance than trying to scramble around at the end when we have a problem, and then we're facing the reliability issues in the moment, as we've seen play out in other places like the UK, for example. So I'll stop there. We've got lots to talk about, and happy to engage in the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. And you basically just teed up the next round of question that I'm going to kick over to Todd here in a second. To tee it up, it's important for folks to recognize that reliability requires planning and having the capability to have enough supply to meet demand, but it also means that when the time comes on an operating basis, that capability performs. And a lot of times we forget about that performance. And one of the big things that Gordon was getting at was alluding to the performance of power plants, making sure things are, when you have these, especially these big cold weather spells, a lot of power plants get forced offline, or a lot of times with the interdependencies with the gas system, we're seeing a lot of like fuel supply considerations factoring in. So I want to go over to Todd here to talk about, there's a long history of gas electric coordination, or sometimes lack thereof, but I think it's generally made in different rounds, degrees of progress between the two industries for a couple decades now. Could you mind giving us like a sort of a brief recap of progress that's been made and what remains undone and what you think about the outstanding things left on that list?
Sure. Thanks, Devin. It's kind of funny you raised this question. I was with my friend Phil Moeller a couple of weeks ago, and Phil was then at FERC, and I was at my prior post at the Ohio Commission. And this was an issue that we were both very focused on after one of the cold weather snaps. I think it was in 2011, and everyone was very spun up about it. Well, that was 15 years ago, and we still haven't solved it. I do think we've made progress, and I'm happy to say that that's been the case. And this problem went back before even 2011. So it's been an ongoing issue. And I think, as Gordon noted, the interdependencies of the system have never been greater. And so I think it's important that we recognize, I mean, we're in the middle of a cold weather snap that is substantially similar, but in some ways even more stressful than Winter Storm Elliott was, because of the scope of the country, the size of the country that is under the cold weather, how long it has lasted and is expected to last. And doing so in a way where the systems really have to work well together. So the stress test that we're under is going to show if some of the improvements have helped. I think the short answer, even at this midpoint of the cold weather, is that we have seen improvements in system performance and coordination between the industries. I think that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that we've solved it, but it means that we have, I think, seen the need for it and have tried to start to address some of those things. EPSA members, like all the parts of the bulk electric system, of course, are subject to and operate under the NERC standards. And NERC has been working on a cold weather standard in order to make sure that we have, better system performance, because it was an identified weakness that they said jeopardizes reliability. So how are we going to work on fixing that? And so our members have spent billions of dollars over the entire fleet to try and winterize and improve performance of the system. And I think that is demonstrated by the better performance that you've seen by a number of the units. Although equipment does break when it runs hard for long periods of time, sometimes that's how machinery works. But you've seen better system performance for sure. And thus far, and I hesitate to even finish my sentence for fear that I jinx it, but the system is performing well through the cold weather issues that we're dealing with right now. So on specific gas electric coordination issues, I think the information sharing has improved dramatically. I think the ability for the RTOs to interact with the gas system and with the power system and speak more common language has improved fairly significantly. I think the efforts that GEAR undertook as part of NERC under first then President Julie Fedorchik and then under President Pridemore's leadership to bring that to fruition has been helpful. The Reliability Alliance that we worked with our friends at NGSA and INGA to try and help taken an industry-led perspective, as well as the National Petroleum Council and now the Natural Gas Readiness Forum, have all tried to bring the operators together in a way that allows us to convene on a regular basis, not when we're in a crisis, to make sure that we're sharing information that I think is helpful. And I think we're starting to see the fruit be borne out of those efforts with improved system performance. So I think that's great. We still see a couple of issues that remain challenging, and we're going through that right now, which is the fuel procurement issue. And is there sufficient pipeline capacity? Is there sufficient volume to get gas? Is there sufficient gas to be put into the system with wellhead freeze-offs and some of the other issues that start way back in the production field, but ultimately are borne out in what's available on the system and what can be supplied to customers? I think we've seen improvement there as well, but that remains an issue that has to be addressed going forward. And at a high level, and Gordon is probably more sensitive to this and probably says, well, I've got a solution for you. And he probably does, which is the cost recovery concern. Markets treat cost recovery differently. Independent market monitors have different views about what's eligible for cost recovery and what can be bid into the system. And I think those questions are yet to be fully resolved in a way that helps to mitigate the volatility and stressful conditions, but ensures ultimately that reliable system. And I'll say it again because I'd be duty bound to do so, but the build out that's coming before us is going to require the need for more pipeline infrastructure as well as more linear infrastructure on the wire side. And so I think we have to be eyes wide open about the need for additional infrastructure to move those molecules from where they're being produced to where they're ultimately going to be consumed. And that's not a short-term issue. That's a medium and longer term problem that's got to be solved. But I think we have to keep that front and center as we look at how we're integrating the two systems. That's going to continue to be fundamentally important.
Absolutely. Thank you, Todd. And I want to actually, since you brought up that last point on gas infrastructure, I want to go over to Gordon next, actually, because No Footprints had more interesting conversations on gas infrastructure than New England. Gordon, if you don't mind weighing in on sort of the trade-offs of having more gas infrastructure or lack thereof, and then please feel free to weigh in on any of the operating side of things too with gas electric.
Sure. So, I'd start off by saying winter reliability really depends on two major factors. The one is winterization of the equipment, and the second is fuel adequacy, and particularly during the cold snaps, sufficient stored fuel supplies. And to get that, you need to have strong performance incentives in the wholesale markets, investment in the requisite fuel infrastructure, and a way to pay for all of this, robust cost recovery mechanisms. So if I just quickly check off the list on winterization, I think after Winter Storm Uri, I think NERC and FERC really moved the ball forward on that. And I wouldn't say it's a completely solved problem, but it's a largely solved problem. People are paying attention to winterization. And we haven't seen any major issues since. As Todd mentioned, there's also been a lot done to try and optimize and extract efficiencies from better alignment of the electric and the gas markets and better information sharing, but it's really only provided incremental gains. The real issue is getting enough infrastructure built. So, the first stage of this, which we've been struggling with for 2 decades, is how do you squeeze more out of the existing system? The next stage is we've run out of capacity on the pipeline system and the storage system. How do you build new capacity to supply electric generators? That's the issue. So I think, and in particular winter peaks, which are low probability events, right? So these things only come along every 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And so I think the root cause of the problem here is a policy and regulatory gap that first emerged over 20 years ago in New England, and it's now become a national issue. So, I'll start with saying from a federal point of view, the wholesale electricity system is regulated under the Federal Power Act, the wholesale gas system under the Natural Gas Act. The laws that were created really didn't contemplate this interconnected system that we have today. They were effectively viewing these two systems as completely independent and in silos. And then when we restructured these industries, or when they were restructured, the restructuring took different paths with different economic structures for cost recovery. And the consequence now, since they've become interdependent, is there's this total mismatch in terms of cost recovery for the underlying networks. So not talking about production here of gas, but the networks for delivering the gas. So if you step back and say, well, the two systems are completely interdependent, insufficient gas infrastructure can lead to unreliable electricity supply, which compromises every sector of the economy, including the ability to supply gas heat to retail customers. And after the Winter Storm Uri event, the first thing I did I asked our system operations group to work with the local gas LDCs and the EDCs to simulate rotating outages, because I wanted to see whether we were prepared for that. We saw that in Texas. They hadn't done that. They didn't know how to do that. So just operationally, could we rotate the feeders? What emerged from that was that the biggest alarm bell came from the gas LDCs, who said, there's no way we can tolerate rotating feeder outages, because what we'll end up doing is a flame out. We'll end up with a flame out on the gas system. It'll take us weeks to restore the gas system. And I've heard the same concerns expressed in New York as well. So if it's in New England and New York, it's up and down at least the East Coast in terms of the low pressure gas system. So that just sort of emphasizes how critically important electric supply is to gas and how important gas is to electric supply. And I thought Winter Storm Uri was going to change things and cause us to address this issue, but I think it ended up being blamed on winterization, and it was localized in Texas, and it really hasn't moved the needle. And so, I fear we're going to need another 2003 event to really move the needle on this issue. And I look at what happened after 2003. Congress empowered FERC and NERC to develop mandatory reliability and cybersecurity standards for the electric industry. And in roughly the same time frame, we had all the ISOs and RTOs standing up structures for optimizing network planning and operations of the electric systems, but we have no equivalent structures in the gas industry. And yet it supplies almost 50% of the energy, the input energy into the electric system. And I stand back and look at our national goal, which is to support the rapid expansion of the electric system to enable the new demand that's coming from the AI data centers and to win the race in AI, and also to support the electrification goals in the states. But this all depends on adequate gas pipeline and storage infrastructure, which from where I'm sitting is planned on an ad hoc basis without any real optimization objective. So I've also spent many hours talking to the merchant generators, and I've come to understand it does not make economic sense for merchant generators to invest in long-term contracts that would be required to ensure adequate pipeline and gas storage infrastructure for these intermittent peaky events, which are low probability. So they would rather price the risk of non-performance of the gas system into their offers, or financially hedge their risk, or physically try and hedge their risk with dual fueling if they can get the siting and the permits for dual fueling. By contrast, the pipeline developers will only invest in new pipelines and storage infrastructure if they have long-term customers. So if it's not the generators, who's the customer? So, New England figured out a workaround to this. I'll come back to it in a moment, but it never was effectuated. So let me first say that the electric industry has solved this problem for the transmission network. The RTOs run competitive processes for procuring additional transmission infrastructure, and they socialize the cost of the network through the regional transmission tariff. But there's no equivalent structure in the gas industry, which really means it comes back to the states to figure out workarounds. And the workaround that was conceived in New England but never put into effect was to require the electric distribution companies, essentially you're putting electric ratepayers on the hook for contracting for firm transportation from the pipelines, and then having the EDCs resell that capacity to merchant generators. So this is much easier in states that haven't restructured. If you're Florida Power and Light, you can do this because when you approve the new merchant gas generator, you're paying for the pipe that has to supply it. But in restructured states, allowing the EDC to commit electric customers to long-term cost recovery of pipelines likely requires legislative approval in each of the states. And if it's a multi-state pipeline, will require multi-state collaboration and compacts. So this is very cumbersome, very slow. It'll run into all kinds of headwinds. There's no way a system like that can scale the pipeline infrastructure at the speed that's needed. And, the final observation I'd make is, Todd's right. There have been efficiencies gained on the margin through better collaboration, but ultimately, there is still latent capacity to be squeezed out of the gas system and optimized, but that's going to require joint operational optimization of the electric and gas systems, which I think is highly unlikely. We have just final example here. In New England, you'll find the LDCs husbanding their stored LNG right until the end of winter because they have a regulatory obligation to do so. So they're not going to release gas out of the LDC storage until mid to late February, maybe March. But if we're facing a reliability event in January, which is going to ultimately compromise the ability to deliver gas heat, what's the point of saving that gas until the last moment? So that's what I mean about the joint optimization of the available gas supplies. But that's going to require a lot more complexity in terms of how do you operate the system jointly from a gas and electric point of view. It's been done in other countries, but I fear that it's going to be hard to do here.
Thanks, Gordon. And you've also made so many good points over the years too about in a region that is oftentimes very skeptical of gas infrastructure expansion, the distinction that's typically motivated by a lot of climate objectives, kind of distinguishing between having enough expanding capacity for gas for periods like this week and the actual burn of gas, which is what's going to determine your emissions. So that's, capacity and gas burn are not necessarily like this automatic one-to-one throughout the year. It's sort of about meeting those peak needs.
And there's an irony here, right? Because so New England has got very aggressive decarbonization goals. And so you achieve that by putting a lot more renewable resources onto the system, hopefully in the future nuclear. But if you're going to double the demand in the region in order to supply the electrification need, setting aside the data centers that might come, what will happen is you're going to drive the average throughput on the gas system down while you drive the peak demand up, right? So that becomes another economic problem that people are just not dealing with right now. And so there's no silver bullet here. There's nothing that can replace the gas other than oil, which is, typically vested in facilities that are 50 years old and are not going to carry us into the future.
Exactly. Absolutely. And so one would think that if this were just a simple matter of getting enough gas infrastructure built, that we understand why New England would be tough, but we would think Texas's problems would be solved, right, Beth? But of course, Texas has had its own nature of challenges on winter weather, including at the gas electric interface, oftentimes for some similar, but sometimes different set of reasons, even when you have robust capacity. So, please tell us the scoop down there and your experience and where things are moving forward.
Well, and I can get on a really bad rant in this topic, as you know, Devin, and so I'm going to try to keep myself restrained. But if I don't, everyone's forewarned. The first thing I would mention is, I appreciate Gordon's sort of and Todd's kind of walking through the gas electricity interactions. All of those are in restructured, under a restructured environment in, quote, the rest of the world. In Texas, the majority of natural gas powered generation is supplied by intrastate pipelines who don't enjoy or aren't required to have the same kind of unbundling and restructuring that has happened in the rest of the country. I would just point folks to the aftermath of Uri. Look at the profits that Energy Transfer, big pipeline supplier of interstate pipeline in Texas, look at their profits of billions during that event versus the loss for the largest generator in Texas, Vistra, which were also in the billions. And that to me tells a story. I think Gordon hit on it when he talked about the increased demand for electricity, the influx of renewables, even particularly in a state like Texas, where we have drastically decarbonized and have a huge influx of renewables because we're rich in those resources, not because of any kind of political drive or desire. That is the economic source to be added. The that dramatically or can have an effect on the amount of energy that's being produced where people make their money versus the demand that's required to be served, which is where the costs are incurred. And that Texas doesn't escape that. Um, I would suggest the even though we're single state jurisdiction, it helps in many ways, but it also intensifies the political power of certain aspects of the industry. And Texas as a state, we continue to hang on to our persona, if nothing else, of oil and gas and producers and the political power that comes with that is very strong, which helps explain some of the reasons in my way of thinking we're kind of behind in the as progressive as we were on the electricity side, we are behind the rest of the country on the gas side. And any kind of discussions of increasing coordination of the two from my perspective, I'm open to others' perspectives, but from my perspective, has just been in name only. And I don't see that there's been very much improvement. Um, the use of fuel oil, that's what we did, after Uri. That was one of the actions that was taken is like, oh, well, let's just pay for this firm fuel supply service that basically is oil in tanks. And as consumers, we're paying for oil in tanks that continues to exist. And it's not on the new gas units. It's all on the 40 to 50 to 60-year-old gas units that they hadn't gotten around to demolishing their tanks. So in some respects, it's kind of a backward look. Um, I would like to think of if there's some way, and certainly in a place like Texas with a singular jurisdiction, it seems like the expansion, there needs to be, it's gas storage. There needs to be an investment in gas storage. It's not just pipelines, it's the ability to withstand, particularly in the wintertime, it's the ability to withstand the production reductions, the production decreases that are going to happen because of the cold weather, particularly in Texas, particularly in a place where coming out of the ground also comes a lot of water. When it's freezing, that water freezes. That's bad. There's just, and even in our most recent cold weather, that really compared to others was sort of a normal, if not warmer, shorter duration. Jury's still out on the final numbers, but my sense that shorter duration certainly, maybe not, probably not as cold as a quote typical winter storm. We still had, I think the number I saw was 15-20% production decreases during that time. And so, you can't increase the demand for the product if you're just assuming it's coming out of the ground at the same time, right? You've got to have some kind of buffer, some sort of buffer system, and creating whether it's and that's where somebody like me who likes markets wonder if, is there really a market here, or is there just the need to we're investing in a lot of other things in the sake of resiliency. Is that another thing that we as consumers should be willing to invest in to ensure resiliency of the generation supply? And I can think of ways to do that, but that's a concept I've been thinking about. I don't believe that it's gotten any air here, but it is a question that will need to be dealt with before the next catastrophe happens, I guess. So.
Yeah, Beth, and thanks for raising the storage piece of it. And I'm glad folks brought up oil too, because the way you provide fuel assurance for a power plant or a set of power plants can have, multiple variables attached to it, right? Sometimes it's, yeah, if we can have better winterization upstream and production, great. But also if you have ample storage, that might do it too. But then you have the delivery mechanisms, right? And it's not just about ample capacity there. It's also increasingly about some of the flux we're putting on the pipeline system with more swings, right? And a lot of those pipes weren't designed with that pressure shift in mind. And so I want to go over to John here because we've talked a lot about um, the production on the power side. I also wanted to flag the delivery, and you all did a study here that was at the kind request of Congress to look at interregional transfer in particular. And I think that's really interesting in the power industry because we have robust processes for regional and local transmission expansion, but we never got around to interregional. And, Todd, I'm glad you brought up Phil Moeller because that was one of his big things when he was at FERC was, boy, shouldn't we had thought about doing interregional, then regional? And we've just never even done interregional effectively in this country. So, John, curious what your study saw in interregional transmission just from that reliability view.
Yeah, great, Devin. I'm glad you brought that up. And kind of before I get right to the transmission, as kind of listening to the previous panelist, which was great, and don't want to repeat anything they said. And panel and participants might be hearing, Gordon, and might say, "Oh, there's the retired guy talking about the electricity problems, right? From the electricity side." But I'll double down and say, the gas industry also has come to the exact same conclusions based on what they're seeing, how their pipes are being utilized different ways, how their production is being decreased during these winter events. So I'll put a plug in for the National Petroleum Council, put a report out at the direction of Secretary Wright. I think it's very comprehensive and kind of goes over exactly what we were talking about, but mostly from the electric side, but from the gas side. So I think that was really important. So when you think about the gas, right, and the challenges in getting gas, and we've seen it year after year, either the winterization or not getting gas problem. So then you think about the transmission. How can I put a lifeline to other areas that might have available energy at the time, right? Having it at the right time, and maybe a system that's not experiencing the same type of weather you're experiencing. If I can get a connection out there, that can really bring energy that's diversified and that might not be experiencing the same type of weather or outages. So there's a huge value to be able to do that comprehensively, plan that. Our ITCS report identifies areas where there is available energy in neighboring areas that can be, then interfaces can be enhanced. Certain places that's going to be very difficult, geographic, political, cross-state, new interconnections. There's a lot of challenges to actually get done. And really, when you think about reliability, it's in all flavors, right? We're looking at some transmission, some local generation that's going to be really important. And I think as it can look at all the different options you have for your energy mix, I can't stress enough, but local generation is going to be very important. That's why we're focused on fixing the gas electric relationship so much. And I think not looking at strictly transmission, it's a huge investment, a lot of risk, and also 10, 15 years for construction. But also in real time, just last week, we saw interconnections from Canada into New England being curtailed under extreme winter conditions, right? So lifelines that were contracted were recalled because the energy was needed in Quebec, and so that neighborly support wasn't sent down to New England. So there's some real challenges in when it comes down to these extreme cold weather. Where's that energy going to flow? Even if I have the wires, right? It might not flow because of extenuating circumstances, but puts the planning really into focus that you can't just string wires, right, between areas. You really have to do comprehensive planning. And like you said, RTOs have been fantastic for regional transmission development and planning, but they do regional transmission planning really well, right? So there really isn't that forum or a place to work through coordinated transmission planning. So certainly some options there, but it is a much longer time frame than the really in the next 3 to 5 years where we see risk.
Devin, could I jump in and add something to what John just said?
Sure.
So I think interregional transmission is not a panacea if there's no energy to be imported, as John just made the point, right? And part of the thing I've been working on with NERC over the years, and Mark Lorby and I spend a lot of time talking about this, is there's a lack of standardization with regard to how people are assessing resource and energy adequacy in each of the regions. There's no standard methodology for doing this. And so, the premise within NERC was always that you don't have to meet any particular resource adequacy or energy adequacy standard. You just needed to contain your risk to yourself. You couldn't lean on your neighbors. So therefore, if there was a problem, you would do load shedding yourself. The problem, though, is that every region, to some degree, takes into account what's called tie benefits in the industry. That you say, well, under the following low probability circumstances, I can assume that my neighbor is going to be able to help me out. So what happens when you get a collective assumption that trends in the wrong direction and you get a storm like the one we've just living through that stretches out thousands of miles? And there is no spare energy to be had anywhere on the system. I think it starts with everyone doing the analysis the same way and not just looking at resource adequacy, but also looking at what is the marginal contribution of the resource fleet in every region under these weather conditions to determine whether or not there is surplus energy available under those conditions. And that will lead you to a more sensible decision about whether you invest more in more local generation and more fuel adequacy in your region, or whether you can build a transmission wire across to the next neighbor and hope that they will be able to help you out under these circumstances. But the point I'm making is you're never going to be able to know unless the analytics are on a common basis. And so one of the things I would really, I've been encouraging NERC to do this, but once again, they're fighting an uphill battle. People don't want them to have this authority to require people to do the analysis the same way. But I think it's the starting point for then understanding how much risk we have. And once we understand how much risk we have, we can then figure out what the solutions are. But at the moment, we're flying blind.
That's a good point, Gordon. I remember just when SPP and MISO started doing interregional planning on transmission, right? They couldn't even agree on the benefits metrics up front. It set us back. I do want to we only have 2 minutes left here, but I want to maybe get to a couple really quick responses on some outstanding questions here. One is for Todd. One from David Sapper, who asked if more IPP consolidation would be needed to enable the expected large gas build out.
I think the short answer is no. I think we have members kind of across the spectrum who are waiting for or trying to achieve the construction of new resources, but they're subject to the same limitations that, we've been talking about since the initiation of the conversation. You have the same problems that our vertically integrated friends have in trying to get the supply chain and the workforce and the permits and all the things that have to be done. So I don't think it's a question of consolidation. There is certainly capital available that is very interested in getting into this space. You see people who have expressed the interest in helping solve the problem, including some of our friends in the vertically integrated community who would like to maybe undo some of the restructuring because they think they can do it better, faster, cheaper, which we, of course, would disagree with. But I think that suggests to me that there is capital willing to flow into the space. The question is, can we get the reasonable degree of certainty that will allow it to flow efficiently? And I think we're starting to see that come unlocked and be able to get there. But, I've answered this question a couple of times, and I don't mean to go on too long, but we've had 3 auctions in 12 months. 3 auctions in 12 months really only starts to inform making 30 and 40-year investment decisions of billions of dollars. So expecting people to write a check for $3 billion in 12 months is a pretty aggressive ask, but I think the signals are starting to be clear, and that's going to unlock the investment that I think is waiting to fill the space.
Fantastic. And I think we've handled one of our other questions on international gas electric examples. But if there's a 20-second, if anyone has a quick 20-second response on countries that you particularly would suggest flagging, please feel free to mention that.
Yeah, I just responded. I think the UK and Spain have got good models. So, Spain, for example, they back into the commitment of the gas system by first figuring out the electric system commitment and then figuring out how much gas has to be scheduled in order to supply the electric generation. And UK has something similar. So, the advantage they have is they have one regulatory jurisdiction there, which is much harder here in the US.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll put a plug in for it's not a foreign country, but Florida. You think that when you look at the risk assessment across North America, the highest areas where there's the most natural gas would be the most risky. You'd think that because of what we're talking about. But in fact, Florida has the highest percentage of natural gas, yet the lowest, almost virtually zero outages due to lack of fuel. So you think about how they achieve that, right? They built the gas pipeline for the generators. They're high pressure, they're firm contracts. They have a mandate to have oil backup because there's a good amount of generation, 16,000 megawatts that's south of any other pipeline options, kind of single contingency there. So there's dual fuel. So they've done things, worked it into their integrated resource plans, not the markets, but I think there's things to learn from the signals that they're putting in that.
Absolutely. And I hate to cut us off here because I know we could go on this rant for another, straight to dinner time here. But and perhaps we'll have demand for a follow-up session. But thanks to all of our panelists and thanks for folks asking questions and turning out here today. Please feel free to drop us a line with any follow-up questions, and we'll try to get those answered for you. But I want to thank everyone for taking their time to participate and listen into today's event. Please have a reliable and affordable rest of your day here and keep warm.